No comment.
It's very Levitical.
It is very Levitical, isn't it? Danger and warning. All the way back in week 1, you may remember I told an anecdote that suggested that Leviticus, the experience of Leviticus, might be like juicy watermelon. Well, we have one final bite of fruit salad for you this morning. And what we've been doing in these Leviticus slots is just exploring the question, why does the church need Leviticus? And this morning we want to think about Leviticus as an eschatological text. In other words, those pictures that we've been seeing, that portrait of what a true worshipper of God looks like, has a bearing as you move forward, as we think about what God is doing and will do in this world, that Leviticus again can be our friend and help us to understand some of those things. So with that in mind, Katie, we were talking about this yesterday, but how does Leviticus as an eschatological text help you as you turn to the New Testament?
Thanks, Jeff. That's such a good question. What is Leviticus? I think you need to ask, what is Leviticus doing in the context of the Pentateuch first? And I think what Leviticus is doing is restoring, it's God restoring or God recreating order amongst his people that he intends to extend to the ends of the earth. And in doing that, the way he does that is by setting apart a people who belong solely to him, to worship him alone. What we find at the end of Leviticus in chapter 26, verses 11 to 12, is his intent to restore his presence amongst his people. And this is the bit that completely gets me. And then it says, and I will not abhor you. And knowing Leviticus, having preached through Leviticus this year, this semester, we know just the gradations of, the barriers of people not being able to come completely into God's presence. It takes priests, it takes sacrifices, it takes offerings. And even then, there's only the high priest who can enter the Holy of Holies. And here God is saying, and I will not abhor you when I restore my presence among you. And then he says, I will walk among you and I will be your God. And that is language we haven't heard since Genesis 2. And it's absolutely extraordinary. But here's the thing, we never see it realized in the Old Testament because that promise is conditional upon Israel's obedience to God. And we're not. We're not wired because of our sinfulness and our brokenness to be completely and wholly obedient. We're wired now as a rebellious people. And it really points us forward to really why Jesus needed to come. He's the solution. And I think that's so comforting that God knew that Jesus was the solution from the beginning. And knowing that Jesus was the solution, it points us forward to Revelation 21, where that grand vision of the new creation, where God will restore his presence amongst his covenant people, and he will be our God. It's just extraordinary. So that's how Leviticus really points us forward to the new creation.
Yeah, it is fascinating how all those themes you just mentioned kind of just bubble to the surface there at the end, don't you? And even that language that sometimes maybe we don't take seriously enough, kind of God's people seeing him face to face. Maybe now, having worked through Leviticus, we sense the enormity of that, which should stir our heart, shouldn't it? As we kind of strived forwards towards that day.
Yeah, I think one of the things I love about Leviticus is it looks back. There's so much about the construction of the tabernacle and the ordering of the priesthood that looks back to creation. But also pushes forward. But because there's this longing, I think. You see it in the installation of the priests in those early chapters after all the sacrifices. This great day, it's almost like the pinnacle of all the sacrifices. The priests are installed, ordained, and in the very first moment, 2 of them are put to death. And there's this longing for something greater, to be able to come into the presence of God in safety. And I think that's what you see ultimately, like Katie said, in Revelation 21, finally approaching the throne of God and of the Lamb.
And I think it's extraordinary. You talked about Nadab and Abihu's death because of their disobedience in the presence of God. The fire came out of the presence of God, yet in 21 we have this vision of there's no light because God's glory is the light. So the fact that we will be able to dwell in the midst of God's glory, and it's not just survival we're talking about, we'll be having fullness of life in the presence of God's glory. It's absolutely extraordinary knowing Leviticus.
And you see that, I think, too, in the stream coming out from the temple in Revelation 21. It's not just the pitchers of water that people have in Leviticus, which is kind of cleansing people and restoring the world, but all of a sudden, from the very presence of God comes this life-giving stream that goes out, touches the whole creation, people, the world, everything, and restores it to what it was intended to be. It's such an incredible picture.
And it's the transformation of the people, isn't it, that enables the restoration of the world. Here's a place that will no longer be defiled by what God's people do, or what anybody does, but totally renewed and restored. And so fascinating, isn't it, how kind of those themes we've been seeing just bubble up right at the end of the canon to shape our view of what to hope for. And yet, as John writes Revelation, he's not just concerned about the kind of far distant future, is he? He sees that working back into the lives of those who claim to follow Jesus now. And even his description of God's people as priests 3 times in Revelation ought to shape the way that we think about ourselves, about what we do, and the way in which we serve God here and now, even as we wait for that end, on the glorious day when Christ will come, satisfying all of our longings, all the longings of God's people through the millennia on that day. And so John's call is to be faithful, to bear that day in mind and be faithful no matter what happens in the interim. Leviticus, as an eschatological text, shaping our hope, little surprise the New Testament picks up that world and invites us to inhabit it again. So there you go. Our last piece of fruit salad for the semester. We hope you've enjoyed it.